Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a new podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why it matters for U.S. foreign policy. On today's show, I speak with Bob Hamilton and Anna Mikulska about their most recent publication for FPRI, Cooperation, Competition, and Compartmentalization, Russian-Turkish relations and their implications for the West. This conversation delved into the bilateral Turkish-Russian relationship and the implications for the West. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome. Today I am talking to Anna Mikulska, who is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a non-resident fellow in energy studies at the Baker Institute. And Robert Hamilton, or Bob Hamilton, is an associate professor of Eurasian studies at the U.S. Army War College and a Black Sea fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Bob and Anna, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aaron. Good to be here.
Having us.
Well, the reason why I wanted to have both of you on is that you two just published a report at FPRI, which we will link to in the show notes below, that looks at an issue or at least a bilateral relationship that I get asked about a lot, and I'm sure that both of you get asked about a lot, which is the Turkish-Russian relationship. And the name of the report is Russian-Turkish Relations and Their Implications for the West. And again, you can find it below. So as I understand it, you two co-authored this. Anna, you looking a little bit at the economic side, and Bob, you looking more at the security side. So perhaps we'll start right there. Maybe I'll go to both of you. Anna, perhaps you could describe in a nutshell how your research evolved in terms of the economic and perhaps energy relationship between the Turks and the Russians, and then Bob, I'll come to you for some stuff on security.
Russia and Turkey are quite interesting, and I think Bob will really expand on it. But coming from the economic perspective, you see quite a lot of collaboration between those two countries. Their economies are large. They are growing. They are growing actually at a very similar trajectory, but they also distinct enough in terms of their exports or imports that they can collaborate or rather than compete for markets. And in that way, that economic relation between those two countries have grown significantly and has been a basis for larger cooperation very often, or has been the point of common understanding, where in other areas there hasn't been one. And as Bob will extrapolate, I'm sure this is very different in other areas of Turkish-Russian relations. So Turkish economy is smaller than the Russian economy, and also Turkish imports of Russian goods are larger than Russian imports of Turkish goods. So there's this imbalance in trade, even though there is a cooperation. As I mentioned, they collaborate because they actually quite different in terms of what they export and import. And one of the most important basis for economic cooperation between Turkey and Russia is energy, and that's where we come to the area that's of my largest interest. So that's my area of research: energy and energy relations, and how it works with countries, how it influences not only their economic but also geopolitical relations and geopolitical relations. So that has been a big part of how Turkey and Russia have been working together. And some of the most important, actually, indicators of how persistent particular economic collaboration can be, particularly in the area of energy, is the natural gas interaction, where we've seen natural gas flowing to Turkey and across Turkey to other countries from Russia on an uninterrupted basis, even when conflicts have occurred. That's kind of the basic, the basis of the economic relations from which I have been viewing their relation and what it means for other parts of the country's collaboration or competition or other type of interactions.
Picking up on that theme, one of the ways that I think I've heard a lot now is the description of this bilateral relationship is competitive cooperation. And Anna just talked a little bit about areas with which there's synergies where they aren't necessarily in competition with one another. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about the security aspects and where there is signs of competition and and sometimes quite stark competition between these two countries.
Sure. And the framework we actually use for the report will be familiar to a lot of people, especially in U.S. government policymaking circles. We use diplomacy or political interaction, informational interaction, how they talk about each other, then military and security interaction, and then, as Anna just covered, the economic interaction. But folks in the U.S. government policymaking world, you'll hear them call those the DIME, the instruments of statecraft, DIM&E. So in the security and military sphere, our sense after we had done all the research and seen the areas of convergence and divergence was the military sphere is where they have managed to compartmentalize very effectively, but it's also the sphere where things could go wrong, badly wrong, with fairly little warning. As we say in the report, contingency happens on the ground, right? And in these two countries are interacting militarily, or have been interacting in several different conflicts. And in some cases they're on the same side, and in some cases they're not. So they interact in Syria, and in some ways they have convergent interests in Syria, and in other ways they have very divergent interests. And we saw that early 2020, where there was that escalation in Syria that very nearly resulted in Russian and Turkish troops shooting at each other. And in fact, a lot of people who studied that incident believe that the Russians were involved in the initial incident, where some 34 Turkish soldiers were killed in Idlib province, Syria, by an airstrike that both the Russians and Turkish agreed to say was carried out by the Syrian regime, but there are indications that there were Russian aircraft in that formation as well. But anyway, so their military interaction, as I said, in Syria, they've managed to compartmentalize their differences fairly effectively. And they interacted more recently in the Libyan civil war, which is sort of in a cooling off phase right now. But they backed different sides in that civil war. They backed different sides. Well, I wouldn't say they backed different sides in the recent war between Armenia and Azerbaijan late last year. Turkey very overtly backed Azerbaijan, to include certainly providing some of the most effective drones that the Azeris used, possibly providing drone operators, certainly providing training for Azeri operators. There were reports, mostly from the Armenian side, that Turkish aircraft were involved in some airstrikes. I don't think that was ever corroborated independently, but there were independently corroborated reports of Turkey sending fighters from Syria to fight on the side of the Azeris against the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. This was a war, my sense is the Russians really did not need this escalation there. I think they were probably fairly upset with Turkey for the escalation. There are people who tell you that Russia won in the end because it was able to put 2,000 peacekeepers on the ground to enforce a ceasefire. I don't know that I call that a victory for Russia. I'm sitting here in the Republic of Georgia, and I know that people here are not happy about the fact of 2,000 additional Russian troops in the South Caucasus, but that's going to be that's a fragile piece, and it's going to be one that's difficult to manage. And the Russians are going to have their hands full, I think, managing that piece. There have been some escalations even since the peacekeepers have been deployed. And then they had a sort of I'd say a public argument with Turkey over the composition of the peacekeeping force, where the Turkish government kept insisting that they would participate in the peacekeeping force, and the Russian government kept insisting that it would be a purely Russian force with only Turkish observers, which to this day, that's where it's remained. But again, our sense from the report is in the security sphere, because of the fact that they interact in so many places and they have diverging interests in some of these conflicts, and they also work through proxies who tend to be less predictable, less professional, and more risk tolerant than the Russians or Turks would be themselves. There's always the possibility that their proxies could get them into a conflict that neither side wants.
You mentioned in the report, this concept of Eurasianism, driving thinking, and in Turkey, this concept of Eurasianism is this idea that there's this cadre of strategic thinkers, both mostly in the armed forces, but also in sort of the broader national security space, which sees Turkey as more as basically a Turkic power, and that its interests do not overlap with the United States and its traditional Western allies. And in fact, the United States and its traditional Western allies are at odds with this sort of view of broader Turkish nationalism and Turkish power, and therefore Turkey has more synergies with that to the east, with the Russians being one such power. I'm curious, as you wrote this report, if you could go a little bit more into depth about sort of the other side of that coin, which is how Russians view the Turkish role in these areas. Anna perhaps talking a little bit about Turkey's strategic position as a conduit for energy exports or even energy transit, and Bob maybe on the security side. So whoever wants to take it first, go ahead and jump in.
The Eurasianism issue, it is actually not only issue between Turkey and the West, but also Turkey and Russia, as both of those countries actually compete in that sphere in a way that a lot of the post-Soviet republics have been seen by Turkey as area where Turkish influence has used to be stronger and could expand going forward. And that has been actually the feel or the idea, especially in the early 2000s, when Turkey really kind of tried to push the Turkic world further and further out towards the Soviet sphere of old Soviet sphere of influence. And that has not really worked well with Russia's idea of what should happen with the post-Soviet world. Quite a lot of competition, and in the end, actually, Turkey was not able to ensure its influence over the area. Really, in part because of how much of the Russian influence was there throughout the Soviet era and then later on. And in a way, the countries kind of keep this kind of more of a pragmatic, relation there. But we do see that Turkey, particularly in recent time, has pushed for more economic collaboration with post-Soviet world, has started signing a lot of economic agreements, cooperation agreements, and that is, I'm sure, watched by Russia quite closely. One of the Turkey has also expanded its natural gas network, and while it has introduced quite a lot or more influx of more Russian gas, it also has become both a destination and transit territory for Azeri gas, which competes with Russian gas getting to Europe. So in a way, Turkey kind of really opened itself to that idea of Eurasia. However, understood this is not necessarily possible given the influence and the strength of Russia in that region. I think one of the reasons why we don't see a bigger confrontation on both sides kind of really taking the pragmatic approach of kind of not hurting each other rather than competing for the leadership is also that while Turkey could potentially become a regional power, if not for Russia, Russia is very much embedded in, or Russia is very much interested not only in being regional power, but also international power. And in a way, it's kind of its attention is divided and not necessarily does it want to involve itself in a larger competition and in a way kind of gives in to some of the Turkey's push into integrating a lot of the post-Soviet world, including through energy, like natural gas imports or being a transit territory for Europe.
The way we dealt with the question of the Eurasianism, the Russian and Turkish sort of Eurasian vocations or Eurasian paths is in the section on diplomatic, political, geopolitical interaction, right, at the level of the international system, where when the two countries meet each other out in the world, one of the things we talked about was this idea that both of them, for the time being at least, have settled on this Eurasian path. And what it has in common is, as you mentioned earlier, Aaron, it is a sort of a rejection of or a distancing from the West, right? That both countries see themselves as taking a road, taking a path that takes them away from the West. And so that sort of unites them. But what I think potentially could divide them is the fact that they define Eurasia differently. The Russians have a much more expansive idea of what the Eurasian space is than Turkey does, but each defines itself as the natural center of Eurasia as they define it, right? So There are clearly areas in their two definitions of Eurasia that overlap. One would be the South Caucasus, especially Azerbaijan, with which Turkey has a special relationship, and then all of Central Asia, all 5 of the former Soviet Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, with which Turkey sees itself as having a special relationship, and so does Russia. So there's also room for competition in this Eurasian path that they both see themselves on. That is probably something that can be managed. That's less likely, I think, to bring them into direct conflict with each other than some sort of military contingency in one of the conflicts they're both present in that I mentioned earlier.
Isn't this why this is like hard to quantify for U.S. interests, right? So like we try and, there's this sense that you want to put things in black and white, right? There's the two frames of the broader Turkey debate in Washington. Because I think the Russia debate in Washington is more or less settled, right? But like the Turkey debate is much more fluid and dynamic. And so on like one end, you have people saying basically Ankara is a lost cause, give up on them. And then you have other people on the other end of the spectrum, which is basically saying Ankara is the only bulwark against Russian expansionism from the South Caucasus to the Levant to North Africa. And I think most reasonable people come down somewhere in between on that. But I think that the difficulty in categorizing this as a binary is because, for exactly what you just said, Bob, is that I get a sense, and perhaps you two can go into it, is that whether these two countries compete, and they do compete, when they seek to resolve those competitions to get back towards that pragmatic cooperative relationship anchored in economics and just simple geography, their diplomatic approaches are often to the exclusion of the West. So here I'm talking a little bit about Nagorno-Karabakh and even to an extent Syria, and how that's a new dynamic with which to deal with. Curious, Bob, if you have any thoughts on that. And then, Anna, something that sticks out in my mind is you've seen a tightening of relations with Ukraine. The Turkish-Ukrainian relationship has always been pretty good, but now they're trying to balance between the Russians and the Ukrainians, I think, pretty effectively. Does that come into tension with some of the natural gas aspects of the relationship, where Turkey could be a bypass to the Ukrainian route to Europe? So, either one of you want to jump in there and take that wherever you want to go, feel free.
Yeah, I'll jump on the first part of the question, Aaron. And, we looked at this, both governments are led by leaders who are authoritarian populists who believe the West is using liberal democracy to destabilize them and their regimes. And so we believe there is a high level of sort of personal convergence and personal trust. And so the personal relationship between Erdogan and Putin sort of acts as a stabilizer for the overall relationship. And then they both lead governments, they both lead political regimes they're hypersensitive to security and preservation of sovereignty, both of which they see as under threat by the West. The irony, of course, is Turkey, it's been a NATO member since the 1950s, and yet the Turkish government still believes, one of its primary threats to its own internal stability comes from its NATO allies. So we definitely see that personal convergence and the convergence at the level of the two political regimes. And as long as I think the two presidents remain in power, that's set to probably continue. The two things in the conclusion that we saw as that could suddenly and rapidly change the relationship is the sudden departure of either Putin or Erdogan or both from the political scene, and then, as I mentioned earlier, a military escalation. But getting back to what should the West do, the part of the question that you asked, what my sense is what we should not do is intentionally try to divide them, right? It should not be, Western policy should not be about trying to make Russia and Turkey compete more or even push them toward conflict, because first of all, that's not what this part of the world needs. There's instability enough in this part of the world without that. Secondly, our policy, in our sense, should be focused on protecting our interests, not trying to damage the interests of Turkey, a NATO ally, and Russia, a country with which we've had a long and really rocky relationship, and who's been an adversary more often than not, but with whom we've never directly been at war, and certainly neither side wants to be. So we need to look at ways to preserve, protect, and advance our interests. And as like you said in the start, that requires a whole lot of context and nuance, and those type of answers don't make for good sound bites. And we talk in the conclusion a little bit about the S-400 issue and about the Syria issue. And what we're suggesting are very sort of gray, nuanced policies that don't often find a lot of traction in Washington, D.C. So it'll be frustrating to some people, but our sense is a binary, a clear choice on Turkey to either label them a competitor, adversary, I don't even know what it would be, they're a NATO ally, or to just let bygones be bygones, right? And meet all of Turkey's demands, some of which the West can't meet. Neither of those is really possible. So that's sort of where we ended up on that question, and then I'll Anna jump in and see what she has to add there on the energy piece.
Sure, it's quite interesting also because in the energy sphere, particularly when it comes to Ukraine, and Ukraine being a transit territory, traditional transit territory for Russian gas to Europe, with Turkey becoming an increasingly important transit territory, potentially placing some of the transit that would be coming through Ukraine. Now, is there a competition? And if so, why do we see Turkish-Ukrainian relations kind of becoming increasingly tighter despite of that, right? So we've seen that the Ukrainian and Turkish governments have kind of collaborated at some points, that the Ukrainians actually have acquired drones from Turkey that they've used in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. We've seen that they've reached out to Turkey as the Russian military has recently kind of encroached more into the territory or towards the east of Ukraine. So it's kind of this odd situation. Like, why would they collaborate if they actually are competition? I think I don't think necessarily this has been construed as competition. So even though Turkish Stream is which has come online recently and could be perceived as part of what will allow Russia to go around Ukrainian transit, I don't think it has been perceived as that as much as, for example, Nord Stream 2, which hasn't been completed, but really is kind of this point of conflict and point of contention in Europe and between Europe and Russia and US and Russia. That's the first. And the second, it kind of shows that Turkey, the way it structures its relationship with Russia, is multidimensional. And it plays its hand when it comes to gas, for example, because it understands that it actually is quite important for Russia as not only as a market which is growing significantly, but also as a territory to transit its gas to particularly Southeast Europe, that doesn't have as much of connection as to external supply of liquefied gas, for example, as the Western Europe or even Northwest Europe or even Central Eastern Europe, which increasingly brings in LNG from other parts of the world, thanks to its two LNG terminals in Poland and Lithuania. So we've seen that Turkey is really kind of expanding on its or thinking about its position, economic position, but in many ways based on its situation with natural gas and how Russia thinks about its future as natural gas supplier for Europe. Turkey is benefiting from that position and is able to do things that are not necessarily consistent with collaboration or cooperation, either economic or diplomatic, when it comes to Russia.
Well, as we come to the end here, perhaps the easiest way to do this is to talk about, Bob, some of those things, some of those nuanced, let's say, and not binary or black and white policy recommendations that you two laid out. Basically how this is going to evolve in the near future. I think it's really hard to even think about that, but it's necessary to try and grapple with to try and frame those policy recommendations. So over to you.
Yeah, so we looked at sort of two specific issues, one being the S-400 issue and the other being Syria, where in Syria, the U.S. and Turkey are on the same side of the role of Assad in post-war Syria question, and are on very different sides in terms of who is a sort of legitimate partner. The United States has partnered for several years with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is really a coalition of Kurdish and Arab militias that, with U.S. special forces and air support, essentially liberated all of Syria east of the Euphrates River from ISIS. Turkey sees the Kurdish part of the SDF as a terrorist organization, and of course wants them off the border. So our sense was we need to look for a way. We should not abandon the SDF completely, but we need to look for a way to deal with Turkey's concerns. Maybe things to consider would be embedding Turkish observers inside of U.S. units that are partnering with the SDF, not necessarily, where you have Turkish officers and SDF leaders in exactly the same spot, but the Turks could be potentially, with the U.S. unit one step removed, so that they understand exactly what's going on. They understand where the SDF is, where the Kurdish part of the SDF is, and it may allay some of their concerns. On the S-400 issue, that's another tough one. Again, context and nuance are really important. Aaron, you and I wrote a piece for War in the Rocks about that, using sort of a Pakistan model of a fairly intrusive U.S. Technical security regime that would sit with the S-400s and make sure that they are not used in a way that would threaten the technology of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. And only if that can be worked out could Turkey be brought back into the F-35 program. The problem here is a problem of trust. I talked to people on the Turkish side, in the U.S. side, and on the Turkish side, I heard that they believe the U.S. is using the technical vulnerability of the F-35 as a fig leaf, and they're really not concerned about that. They just want a way to punish Turkey for buying the S-400. When I talk to people on the U.S. side who know the technical issues, they say, look, the technical issues of having those two systems operating in the same airspace are essentially insurmountable. So if the F-35 is flying and the S-400 radars are turned on, over time, the S-400 will gain enough information on the F-35 to compromise some of the technology. So again, I think the only way to bridge that divide is having folks on the ground. In this case, it would be U.S. people on the ground where the S-400s are operating to make sure that they aren't switched on. Or the U.S. could always consider buying the S-400s from Turkey. Turkey originally wanted Patriot missiles. They didn't want the S-400 initially, but they were unable to get the type of Patriots they wanted in the time that they wanted them, and so they opted for the Russian missiles instead. So another idea we explored a little bit in the end of the paper is a U.S. purchase of the S-400s.
Anna, perhaps the final words over to you.
Well, and supporting the way that Turkey has been developing the economic relation with Russia, I think there's also something to be said about it. In particular, with energy, it's actually quite important because Turkey has diversified its energy resources quite significantly, especially in natural gas, where geopolitical influence could be the highest if a source of natural gas is a lone gas source and could dominate the region. So Turkey has developed quite a diversity, not only when it comes to natural gas, but generally has increased has put out different sources of energy supply. And I think that's important because in many ways it increases its bargaining position against Russia and balances the relationship, giving Turkey also a better kind of, chance or not free, but freer hand to reach out to countries like Ukraine and work with them at points. And that could be a very important part when we think about, about the Crimea issue and Russian presence there and the concerns of both of countries when it comes to presence.
I would encourage everybody to dig into the report. I mentioned that at the outset. The report is called Cooperation, Competition, and Compartmentalization, Russian-Turkish Relations and Their Implications for the West. So with that, Bob, I think I jumped the gun in saying Anna had the last word. I think you have the last word because there is a disclaimer that we have to mention about the content of this podcast before we do the ultimate sign-off. So you have the last word before I take us away. Aaron.
Yeah, thank you. So, just both the report and my remarks here are my own. The opinions are my own. They don't reflect the policy or position of the U.S. Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. So with that out of the way, back to you.
Thank you. And with that, Bob and Anna, thanks for writing the report, and thanks for coming on and talking about it and accommodating my schedule. And with that, thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Chain Reaction. Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes and Spotify, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the handle @FPRI. Chain Reaction is a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit www.fpri.org.